Admiral Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UES Titan, watching the alien ships dance through space like glowing butterflies, their crystalline hulls catching starlight and throwing it back in rainbow patterns that hurt his eyes to look at directly, and he wondered if these beautiful creatures had ever seen what real war looked like, or if they were about to learn the hard way that the universe was not always as peaceful as their homeworld commander Lisa Campbell worked at her translation station, trying to make sense of the musical language that came through their communications array, her fingers dancing across holographic controls as she adjusted frequency patterns and syntax algorithms, while the Zephyrian fleet commander spoke in tones that sounded more like singing than military orders. And every few minutes she would look up at Admiral Morrison with growing concern written across her face. First alien message had arrived 3 months ago with fanfare and celebration throughout Earth's colonies. But now Jake was beginning to understand that first contact might not be the blessing that humanity had hoped for, because the Zephyrians seemed to view Earth's warships with the same disgust that humans might feel when looking at medieval torture devices, and their translator kept using words like primitive and barbaric when describing human military technology. Captain Ryan Burke stood at the tactical station with his arms crossed over his broad chest, his weathered face showing the kind of expression that veteran soldiers wore when they watched civilians play with dangerous toys. And he kept shaking his head as he studied the alien vessels through the ship's sensors, noting their complete lack of armor plating or defensive systems or anything that might help them survive actual combat. The Zephyrian ships looked like works of art that belonged in a museum rather than the cold vacuum of space, with flowing curves and decorative elements that served no practical purpose except to please the eye. And their hulls were made from some kind of transparent crystal that allowed Jake to see right through to the interior chambers, where alien crew members moved about in robes that seemed to shift color with their emotions. Dr. Amanda Foster entered the bridge carrying a tablet full of research notes and cultural analysis, her expression showing the kind of academic excitement that xenobiologists felt when they encountered a completely new form of intelligent life. But Jake could see worry in her eyes too, because she had been studying Zephyrian society for weeks and had discovered some troubling facts about their peaceful civilization. Lisa's translation equipment beeped with an incoming message, and she listened carefully before turning to face Admiral Morrison with a frown that told him the news was not good. And when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of diplomatic crisis, hanging over their first contact mission like a dark cloud. Alien Fleet Commander was demanding that Earth decommission all military vessels before any formal diplomatic relations could begin, because the Zephyrian Collective considered armed spacecraft to be evidence of a savage and uncivilized species that posed a threat to galactic peace. And he had used the word abomination when describing the UES Titan's weapon systems and armor plating. Jake felt his jaw clench as he processed this information, because he knew that humanity's warships looked the way they did for very good reasons, with every scar and modification telling stories of battles fought to protect Earth's colonies from pirates and hostile alien encounters. And the thick armor plating that the Zephyrians found so offensive had saved thousands of human lives during the Proxima Centauri conflict. Ryan Burke made a sound that was half laugh and half growl as he studied the alien ships through his targeting systems, and he turned to Admiral Morrison with the kind of expression that career military officers wore when politicians tried to explain warfare to them, his voice carrying decades of combat experience when he spoke about the tactical weaknesses he could see in the Zephyrian fleet. The alien vessels had no visible weapons beyond what appeared to be mining lasers and construction tools. Their engines were designed for efficiency rather than speed or maneuverability, and their beautiful crystal hulls would shatter like glass if they ever encountered real military-grade weapons. which made Jake wonder how these people had survived long enough to develop space travel without learning the hard lessons that had shaped human military doctrine. Dr. Foster consulted her tablet and confirmed Jake's worst fears when she reported that Zephyrian civilization had not experienced major warfare for over 1,000 years, their society having evolved beyond the need for conflict resolution through violence, and they genuinely believed that any species still using military force was too primitive to join their galactic community of peaceful races. The cultural gap between humanity and the Zephyrians seemed impossibly wide, as Jake realized that these aliens viewed human military technology the same way that humans might view stone axes or crossbows, as crude relics of a barbaric past that civilized beings had moved beyond, and they could not understand why Earth insisted on building ships that looked like floating fortresses. Instead of works of art, Lisa received another transmission from the alien fleet commander, who is now requesting permission to board the UES Titan and inspect their weapon systems personally, because the Zephyrian Peace Council needed detailed reports about human military capabilities before making any decisions about diplomatic recognition. And his musical voice carried tones that the translation computer identified as disgust. And concerned Jake knew that allowing aliens aboard a human warship was always risky, but he also understood that this might be their only chance to make the Zephyrians understand that Earth's military technology was designed for defense rather than aggression. Even though he suspected that distinction would be lost on a species that had forgotten what real threats looked like, the Admiral gave permission for a small diplomatic party to come aboard while privately wondering if showing these peaceful aliens around a human warship might be the worst mistake he had ever made. Because once they saw Earth's weapons systems up close, they would probably recommend immediate quarantine for the entire human species, and humanity's dreams of joining the galactic community would end before they had truly begun. Ryan Burke prepared the ship for alien visitors, while muttering under his breath about species that had grown soft during long periods of peace. And he made sure that all weapon systems were in standby mode, because he did not want to accidentally trigger a diplomatic incident by having a plasma cannon power up while their guests were touring the armory. Dar Foster gathered her research materials and prepared to serve as cultural liaison during the alien visit. But she was beginning to realize that the gap between human and Zephyrian worldviews might be too wide to bridge with simple explanation, because these aliens had never needed to learn the harsh lessons that had shaped human civilization through millennia of warfare and struggle. The Zephyrian shuttle approached the UES Titan like a butterfly landing on the hull of a battleship, its graceful curves and glowing decorations making the human vessel look even more brutal and intimidating by comparison. And Jake wondered if this first meeting between their species would end in understanding or in the kind of cultural clash that could doom any hope of peaceful coexistence between Earth and the galactic community. 3 weeks had passed since the first meeting between humans and Zephyrians, and the diplomatic negotiations were going badly as both species struggled to understand each other's way of thinking about war and peace and the role that military force played in maintaining civilization, while Admiral Jake Morrison found himself caught between his duty to represent humanity honestly and his desire to avoid scaring the aliens with stories of human conflict. The Zephyrian delegation had established a temporary embassy aboard their flagship, a vessel called the Luminous Dream that looked more like a floating palace than any kind of spacecraft that humans would recognize, with gardens growing inside transparent domes and waterfalls cascading through chambers filled with crystalline sculptures that sang when the solar wind touched them. And Ambassador Kethvar had invited the human leadership to visit his ship for what he called a cultural exchange. Ceremony Lieutenant Sophie Adams ran continuous sensor sweeps of the Zephyrian fleet from her station aboard the UES Titan. And what she discovered made her increasingly worried about the aliens' ability to defend themselves if they ever encountered hostile forces. Because their ships had virtually no armor beyond decorative plating that would not stop a child's toy laser. And their energy shields were designed to protect against radiation and space debris rather than military-grade weapons. Captain Nicole Torres had been chosen to lead the human diplomatic team because of her background in xenology and her reputation for tact, but even she was struggling to find common ground with aliens who seemed to view any discussion of military tactics as evidence of humanity's savage nature. And every time she tried to explain Earth's defensive strategies, the Zephyrians would recoil in horror as if she had suggested eating their young. The cultural exchange began with a tour of the Luminous Dreams art galleries, where Ambassador Kethver proudly showed off thousands of years of Zephyrian creativity in the form of light sculptures and gravity paintings and musical compositions that existed only in mathematical equations. And Captain Torres found herself genuinely impressed by the aliens' artistic achievements, even as she noticed the complete absence of anything that might be used for defense. Commander Ben Parker accompanied the human delegation as military advisor, and he spent most of the tour studying the ship's construction methods and noting the obvious weaknesses in their design philosophy. Because while the Zephyrian vessel was undeniably beautiful, it was also incredibly fragile, with structural supports that prioritized aesthetic appeal over load-bearing capacity and corridors that would become death traps if the ship ever took battle damage. The aliens seemed genuinely puzzled by human interest in military history and kept asking why Earth's people spent so much time studying warfare instead of focusing on art and philosophy and the peaceful sciences that had allowed Zephyrian civilization to flourish for millennia. And Ambassador Kethver repeatedly used their word for sickness when describing humanity's apparent obsession with conflict and violence. Dr. Helen Carter tried to bridge the cultural gap by explaining that human military development had been driven by necessity rather than choice, because Earth's history included many periods when peaceful civilizations had been conquered or destroyed by more aggressive neighbors, and the lessons learned from those conflicts had shaped humanity's approach to space exploration and colonization. But the Zephyrians seemed unable to comprehend the concept of involuntary warfare. The breaking point came when Ambassador Kethvar asked to see historical records of human space battles, apparently thinking that such footage would be similar to their own ceremonial combat demonstrations. And Dr. Carter made the mistake of showing him archive footage from the Battle of Europa, where human warships had fought desperately against overwhelming odds to protect civilian evacuation ships. Zephyrian Ambassador watched in growing horror as human vessels absorbed devastating damage and continued fighting, their crews making repairs under fire, while emergency bulkheads sealed off sections of the ship that had been blown open to space. And when one of the human destroyers rammed an enemy battleship to save a hospital ship full of wounded civilians, Ambassador Kethvar became physically ill and had to be helped from the viewing chamber. Lieutenant Sophie Adams tried to explain that the human crews in the footage were heroes who had sacrificed themselves to save innocent people. But the aliens interpreted their actions as evidence of a species so addicted to violence that they would rather die fighting than surrender or negotiate. And Ambassador Kethver declared that humanity was too dangerous to be allowed into the galactic community without major reforms to their military philosophy. The situation deteriorated further when Commander Ben Parker attempted to demonstrate human defensive technology by showing the aliens how the UES Titan's armor plating could withstand simulated weapons fire. And the Zephyrians were horrified to learn that human ships were specifically designed to survive direct hits from weapons that could vaporize their own vessels, which they interpreted as proof that humanity expected to fight wars rather than prevent them. Captain Nicole Torres realized that the cultural exchange was becoming a disaster as Ambassador Kethver began transmitting reports back to the Zephyrian homeworld describing humans as a warrior species that glorified violence and built weapons of unimaginable destructive power. And she knew that such reports would likely result in humanity being quarantined from the rest of galactic civilization until they proved they could. Abandon their military ways, the Zephyrians could not understand that human warships looked brutal and intimidating because they had been designed by people who understood that the universe contained genuine threats that could not be reasoned with or negotiated away. And their own 1,000 years of peace had left them completely unprepared to comprehend the harsh realities that had shaped human military. Doctrine through countless conflicts and hard-won victories, Dr. Helen Carter made one final attempt to explain human military philosophy by describing how Earth's defensive forces had evolved to protect rather than conquer. But Ambassador Cuthbert responded that any species which chose to solve problems through violence rather than diplomacy was inherently dangerous, and he could not recommend allowing such beings to interact with peaceful civilizations that had moved beyond the need for warfare. Human delegation returned to the UES Titan, knowing that their first contact mission was probably doomed because the fundamental differences between human and Zephyrian worldviews seemed impossible to bridge. And Admiral Jake Morrison found himself facing the possibility that humanity might be forced to remain isolated from the galactic community simply because they had never forgotten how to defend themselves. Lieutenant Sophie Adams continued her sensor analysis of the Zephyrian fleet and made a disturbing discovery when she detected unusual energy signatures at the edge of the solar system, readings that did not match any known Zephyrian technology and suggested the presence of ships using advanced stealth systems. But when she reported her findings to Admiral Morrison, he decided not to share this information with the aliens until he could confirm what they were dealing with. Negotiations continued for several more days, with both sides becoming increasingly frustrated as the Zephyrians demanded that humanity abandon their military technology as a prerequisite for diplomatic recognition, while the humans tried to explain that their weapons existed to protect rather than threaten. And neither species seemed capable of understanding the other's perspective on the role that force played in maintaining peace and security. Commander Ben Parker began conducting discrete scans of the approaching energy signatures and realized that they belonged to ships unlike anything in either the human or Zephyrian databases. Vessels that seemed to be designed purely for destruction and conquest, and he quietly alerted Admiral Morrison that they might be facing a threat that would test both species' commitment to their respective philosophies about war and peace. Cultural misunderstanding between humans and Zephyrians was about to become irrelevant as something much more dangerous approached their position, and neither species was prepared for what was coming toward them through the darkness between the stars. Commander Pete Johnson stood at his sensor station aboard the UES Guardian, watching readings that made his blood run cold, because the energy signatures at the edge of the system were not random space phenomena or navigation errors, but actual spacecraft using stealth technology far more advanced than anything either humans or Zephyrians possessed. And the ships were moving in formation patterns that suggested military discipline and hostile intent. Guardian was positioned 3 light hours away from the main diplomatic fleet as an early warning picket, and Pete had been monitoring deep space communications for 2 weeks when he first detected the anomalous readings, faint traces of exotic matter and folded space that indicated ships running silent through the outer system, while scanning both the human and Zephyrian fleets with sensors that were barely detectable even to Earth's most sophisticated equipment. Captain Michelle Brown received Pete's initial report with skepticism because the readings were so faint they could have been sensor ghosts or interference from the system's twin pulsars. But when the same signatures appeared on 3 different monitoring stations over the course of 6 hours, she realized they were dealing with a genuine contact, and she ordered all human ships to begin discreet defensive preparations. While maintaining the appearance of normal diplomatic operations, Intelligence Officer Greg Miller had been analyzing intercepted communications from various sources throughout the local stellar region. And what he discovered painted a terrifying picture of systematic destruction moving through this part of the galaxy. Because over the past 5 years, more than 30 peaceful civilizations had simply vanished without explanation, their colonies going silent and their trade routes abandoned, as if entire species had been erased from existence. The pattern was always the same according to Greg's analysis, with advanced peaceful civilizations disappearing first, while more primitive or militaristic species were ignored. And the attacks always came without warning, against targets that possessed beautiful cities and advanced technology, but lacked effective military defenses. Which made Greg realize that someone or something was specifically hunting peaceful civilizations. Like the Zephyrian's Captain Michelle Brown studied the intelligence reports and felt her stomach turn as she realized that the approaching ships probably belonged to whatever force had been systematically destroying peaceful species throughout this region of space. And the fact that they had arrived just as humans and Zephyrians were conducting diplomatic negotiations could not be a coincidence, because predators often followed the communication signals that marked first contact between. Species Admiral Jake Morrison received Michelle's emergency transmission while attending another frustrating diplomatic session with Ambassador Kefar, and he had to maintain his composure while learning that hostile forces were possibly moving toward their position, because showing concern or fear would only reinforce Zephyrian beliefs about human paranoia and militaristic thinking. So he excused himself from the meeting and gathered his senior staff for a non-emergency conference. The human fleet commanders met in the secure briefing room aboard the UES Titan, where Michelle's holographic image delivered her report about the mysterious contacts and their probable hostile intentions. And Admiral Morrison realized that he was facing an impossible situation, because warning the Zephyrians might cause panic and diplomatic breakdown, while not warning them could result in the complete destruction of their beautiful but defenseless. Fleet Commander Ben Parker studied the tactical situation and pointed out that the Zephyrian ships were positioned in ceremonial formations that prioritized visual appeal over defensive considerations, with their most important vessels clustered together in patterns that would allow a competent enemy to destroy multiple targets with single attacks. And their complete lack of combat experience meant they would probably panic and scatter if attacked, rather than fighting in organized units. Lieutenant Sophie Adams had been monitoring Zephyrian communications and reported that the aliens were completely unaware of any potential threat, their sensor operators apparently lacking the training or equipment necessary to detect stealth signatures, and their conversations focused entirely on art and philosophy and their growing concern about human militaristic tendencies rather than the possibility that actual danger might be approaching their position. Dr. Helen Carter suggested that they should warn the Zephyrians despite the diplomatic risks, because allowing innocent beings to be slaughtered would violate every principle that human civilization claimed to represent. But Admiral Morrison knew that the aliens would probably interpret such warnings as human paranoia, or possibly even as threats designed to manipulate them into accepting Earth's military protection. Debate continued for hours as human officers argued about whether to maintain the diplomatic facade or prepare for combat. And during that time, the mysterious contacts continued moving through the outer system, while conducting what appeared to be reconnaissance operations, scanning both fleets and probably analyzing their defensive capabilities and tactical weaknesses. Greg Miller's analysis suggested that the approaching force belonged to something called the Void Hunters, based on fragmentary communications intercepts and survivor reports from the few civilizations that had managed to send warning messages before being destroyed. And according to those reports, the Hunters were a nomadic military force that consumed the resources of peaceful civilizations to fuel their own expansion across the Galaxy, the Void Hunters apparently used advanced stealth technology and overwhelming firepower to destroy their targets before any effective resistance could be organized, and they seemed to prefer attacking species that had developed advanced technology and art, but had neglected military development, which made the Zephyrians perfect targets for their systematic predation. Admiral Morrison made the difficult decision to begin preparing the human fleet for combat while maintaining the appearance of normal diplomatic operations, and he ordered all ships to begin charging their weapon systems and extending their armor plating under the cover of routine maintenance procedures, because he knew that once the hunters revealed themselves, there would be no time for extended preparations. The Zephyrians remained completely oblivious to the approaching danger as they continued their diplomatic discussions and cultural exhibitions, their beautiful ships maintaining their ceremonial formations while their crews focused on art projects and philosophical debates rather than the harsh realities of survival in a dangerous galaxy. And Ambassador Kethvar continued transmitting reports to his homeworld, describing human military preparations as evidence of their violent nature. Captain Nicole Torres tried to subtly suggest that the Zephyrian fleet should adopt more defensive positioning for safety reasons, but the aliens interpreted her suggestions as more proof of human paranoia and militaristic thinking, and they actually moved their ships into even more vulnerable formations to demonstrate their commitment to peaceful principles and their rejection of human-style defensive strategies. Commander Pete Johnson aboard the Guardian continued tracking the approaching contacts and realized that the hunters were moving much faster than initial estimates had suggested, using some kind of advanced propulsion system that allowed them to cover interstellar distances in days rather than weeks. And his latest calculations indicated that the enemy fleet would reach attack range within 72 hours. The human commanders knew they were facing a nightmare scenario because they would have to defend not only their own ships, but also the completely unprepared Zephyrian fleet, and the aliens' refusal to acknowledge any threat meant that they would be fighting to protect people who viewed their protectors as the real danger to galactic peace. Admiral Morrison sent coded messages to all human vessels ordering them to prepare for combat while maintaining diplomatic appearances, and he began the agonizing process of deciding whether to reveal the approaching threat to the Zephyrians or wait until the last possible moment to avoid panic, knowing that either choice could result in disaster for both species. The storm was approaching through the darkness between stars, while the beautiful alien ships continued their graceful dance through space, completely unaware that their 1,000 years of peace were about to end in fire and death, unless the species they considered barbaric could protect them from enemies. They had forgotten how to fight. The Void Hunter fleet emerged from hyperspace like a plague of mechanical locusts descending upon a garden, their ships materializing in perfect attack formation as reality twisted around their hulls and deposited them within striking distance of both the human and Zephyrian fleets. And Admiral Jake Morrison felt his blood freeze as he saw what humanity was about to face in combat for the first time. Hunter vessels looked like nightmares, brought to life in metal and energy, with hulls that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and weapon systems that bristled from every surface, like the spines of some deadly sea creature. And each ship was easily twice the size of the largest human warship, while radiating the kind of malevolent energy that came from technology designed purely for destruction and conquest. Captain Ryan Burke watched the enemy fleet deploy through his targeting systems and realized that everything the intelligence reports had said about Void Hunter capabilities was probably an underestimate, because these ships moved with a precision and coordination that spoke of centuries of military experience, and their weapons were already powering up with energy readings that made human plasma cannons look like children's toys. First Hunter Salvo lit up space with beams of coherent destruction that reached across thousands of kilometers to strike the outer edge of the Zephyrian formation, and the beautiful alien ships simply ceased to exist as the enemy weapons tore through the air. Crystal hulls like tissue paper, vaporizing entire vessels in seconds, while their crews never had time to understand what was happening to them. Ambassador Kethvar's panicked voice filled every communication channel as he screamed for help from anyone who could hear him. His musical language twisted into sounds of pure terror as he watched his people die around him. And the graceful ships that had looked so beautiful dancing through space became clouds of glittering debris that reflected the light of their own destruction. Zephyrian defensive response was pathetic to watch as their mining lasers and construction tools tried desperately to fight back against weapons designed for military combat. Their energy beams barely scratching the hunter armor, while return fire obliterated ship after ship in brilliant flashes that left nothing behind but expanding spheres of superheated. Gas Admiral Jake Morrison gave the order that would change the course of galactic history as his voice cut through the chaos on every human communication channel, telling his fleet to engage the enemy with all available firepower, while the Zephyrians learned too late that there were some problems in the universe that could not be solved through art and diplomacy and peaceful negotiation. The UES Titan surged forward with its weapon systems charging to full power, and for the first time, the Void Hunters encountered an enemy that had been designed specifically to absorb punishment and keep fighting, because the human ship's scarred armor plating and redundant systems allowed it to survive direct hits that would have vaporized any Zephyrian vessel. Captain Ryan Burke coordinated the human fleet's attack pattern with the skill of someone who had spent his entire life preparing for exactly this kind of battle, and the hunter commanders found themselves facing tactics and strategies that they had never encountered before, because most of their previous victims had been peaceful species with no real understanding of military combat. Human warships fought in ways that defied every assumption the Void Hunters had made about their capabilities, using damage control, procedures, and emergency repairs that allowed them to continue fighting even after losing entire sections of their hulls. And their crews adapted to battle damage with a flexibility that came from generations of military tradition and hard-won. Experienced Lieutenant Sophie Adams watched her sensor displays track the battle as human ships absorbed devastating damage, and somehow kept fighting, their ugly utilitarian designs proving their worth as vessels built for survival rather than beauty. And she realized that every scar and modification on the human fleet told stories of previous battles that had taught Earth's engineers how to build ships that could bring their crews home alive. The Void Hunters had grown accustomed to crushing peaceful civilizations that folded quickly under their initial assault. But humanity represented something they had not encountered in their expansion across the galaxy, a species that had never stopped learning how to fight and had built their entire military philosophy around the concept of surviving against impossible odds. Commander Ben Parker led a flanking attack that caught a group of hunter-destroyers off guard, and his ship's weapons tore through their armor with the kind of focused brutality that came from understanding exactly where to hit an enemy to cause maximum damage, while his crew worked with the smooth efficiency of people who had trained for this moment their entire lives. The battle raged across light minutes of space as human and hunter fleets exchanged fire that could be seen from neighboring star systems, and the Zephyrians who survived the initial attack watched in amazement as the species they had dismissed as primitive barbarians fought with a skill and determination that kept the enemy from achieving their usual quick victory. Dr. Helen Carter worked frantically to coordinate rescue operations for surviving Zephyrian crew members while the battle continued around them, and she began to understand that the cultural gap between humans and aliens was not about violence versus peace, but about those who remembered how to defend themselves and those who had forgotten that freedom required eternal vigilance. The Void Hunters found their perfect formation disrupted by human tactics that emphasized individual initiative and adaptive thinking rather than rigid adherence to predetermined battle plans. And their commanders began making tactical errors as they struggled to counter an enemy that refused to behave according to their established patterns of conquest. Captain Nicole Torres brought her ship alongside a damaged hunter cruiser and demonstrated why human warships looked so different from everyone else's, as her vessel's reinforced hull and close-range weapon systems allowed her to engage in the kind of brutal point-blank combat that would have been suicide for any ship designed primarily for beauty or efficiency. Tide of battle began to turn. As more human ships arrived from their patrol positions throughout the system, each vessel bearing the scars and modifications that marked them as survivors of previous conflicts. And the Void Hunters realized they were facing an enemy that had been forged in the fires of constant warfare rather than weakened by. Extended Peace Ambassador Kethfer found himself aboard the UES Titan after his own ship was destroyed, and he watched through the bridge viewports as human crews performed repairs under fire while emergency bulkheads sealed off damaged sections, finally understanding that the brutal appearance of Earth's warships was not evidence of primitive savagery, but proof of hard-won wisdom about survival in a dangerous universe. Void Hunter fleet began to withdraw as their commanders realized that this would not be the easy victory they had expected, because humanity represented something they had not encountered before in their predatory expansion. A species that had learned to fight, not because they enjoyed violence, but because they understood that some evils could only be stopped by those willing to stand against them with weapons in their hands. The battle was far from over, but the Hunter retreat marked the first time in decades that one of their target civilizations had survived the initial assault, and both humans and Zephyrians began to understand that the galaxy was about to change in ways that neither species had anticipated. When they first made contact, the battle continued for 18 brutal hours as human warships fought with a determination that amazed the surviving Zephyrians, who watched from their emergency shelters aboard the few remaining alien vessels, and Commander Lisa Campbell coordinated damage control efforts across the human fleet, while enemy fire continued to hammer their ships with weapons designed to crack planets and boil away. Atmosphere's Captain Ryan Burke's tactical display showed the true cost of the engagement as ship after ship reported critical damage to their hulls and weapon systems. But every human vessel that could still move kept fighting with the kind of stubborn refusal to surrender that had carried Earth's people through countless wars, and their crews performed miracles of engineering as they rerouted power through damaged systems and jury-rigged repairs that would have been impossible for anyone who had not grown up understanding that sometimes survival meant making broken things work. Void Hunter fleet had expected quick victory against another peaceful civilization, but instead found themselves trapped in the kind of grinding, attritional warfare that their commanders had not experienced in decades. Because humanity represented something unique in their expansion across the galaxy, a species that had learned to absorb terrible punishment and keep fighting until the last possible moment. Admiral Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UES Titan, watching his fleet die around him while knowing that retreat was not an option, because behind them lay the defenseless Zephyrian colonies, and beyond those, the inner worlds of human space, where billions of innocent people would face the same fate that had befallen so many other civilizations. And he gave orders that sent ship after ship into attacks that had little chance of success, but might buy precious time for evacuation efforts. Lieutenant Sophie Adams tracked the movements of both fleets through her sensor arrays and realized that the human ships were fighting in ways that defied every tactical manual ever written, using ramming attacks and suicide runs and desperate close-range engagements that turned space battles into the kind of brutal knife fights that no sane military commander would ever choose, but which sometimes represented the only way to stop an enemy that possessed overwhelming technological advantages. Turning point came when Captain Nicole Torres led a coordinated attack against the Hunter flagship, bringing her heavily damaged cruiser alongside the massive alien vessel and using her ship's emergency fusion reactors as improvised weapons. And the resulting explosion tore through both ships while creating an expanding field of radioactive debris that disrupted Hunter formations and communications. Dr. Helen Carter worked frantically in the medical bays, treating wounded crew members from both human and Zephyrian ships while the battle raged outside. And she began to understand that the difference between her species and the aliens was not about intelligence or morality, but about the willingness to pay prices that peaceful civilizations found unacceptable, because freedom had always required people willing to sacrifice everything to defend it. The Void Hunters found their carefully planned assault dissolving into chaos as human commanders ignored conventional tactics and used their ships in ways that prioritized mission accomplishment over crew survival, ramming damaged vessels into enemy formations and using wounded ships as weapons platforms until their hulls finally gave way under the accumulated stress of continuous combat. Ambassador Kethfer stood beside Admiral Morrison on the bridge of the Titan, watching human crew members perform their duties with quiet efficiency, despite the fact that their ship was literally falling apart around them. And for the first time, he began to understand that the scars and modifications that made human warships look so ugly were actually beautiful in their own way, because every mark told stories of people who had chosen to fight rather than surrender. The Hunter fleet began to show signs of tactical confusion as their commanders struggled to adapt to an enemy that seemed willing to accept any level of casualties to achieve their objectives. And several alien vessels broke formation when human ships used kamikaze attacks that traded single vessels for multiple enemy targets, because the Void Hunters had never encountered a species that considered such sacrifices acceptable losses. Commander Ben Parker brought his ship through the Hunter defensive perimeter using maneuvers that should have been impossible for a vessel with so much battle damage, and his crew's ability to keep fighting despite losing atmosphere and artificial gravity demonstrated the kind of trained competence that came from understanding that their survival depended entirely on their own skills and determination. The climactic moment arrived when the UES Guardian rammed directly into the Hunter command ship while its crew transmitted targeting data for the rest of the human fleet. And the coordinated missile barrage that followed shattered the alien vessel's shields and left it defenseless against follow-up attacks that sent it tumbling through space as a burning wreck. Remaining Void Hunter ships began withdrawing from the battle as their commanders realized that this engagement had cost them more vessels than they had lost in their previous 10 campaigns combined. And they transmitted warnings to their home fleet about the unexpected resistance they had encountered from a species that fought with tactics and weapons designed specifically for this kind of desperate struggle. Ambassador Kethfar watched the enemy retreat through the viewports of the damaged human flagship and finally understood why Earth's warships looked the way they did. Because every ugly protrusion and brutal modification served a purpose that had been learned through bitter experience. And the scars that covered their hulls were not signs of primitive technology, but proof of wisdom gained through generations of conflict. The aftermath of the battle revealed the true cost of victory as human ships limped through space with their hulls breached and their crews working around the clock to keep basic life support functioning. And the surviving Zephyrians began to comprehend that their rescue had been purchased with sacrifices that their own peaceful culture would never have been willing to make. Dr. Helen Carter organized relief efforts for both species, while Admiral Morrison surveyed the wreckage of what had been 2 complete fleets only hours before. And she realized that the galaxy would never be the same because the Void Hunters had finally encountered a species that could match their brutality with something even more dangerous: the quiet determination of people who fought not because they enjoyed violence, But because they understood that some things were worth dying for, the Zephyrian survivors would spend the next several years rebuilding their military capabilities under human guidance, learning the hard lessons that their 1,000 years of peace had allowed them to forget, and they would never again question why some species chose to build ships that looked like instruments of war rather than works of art. Captain Ryan Burke stood among the wreckage of his tactical station, giving orders to search and rescue teams, while knowing that many of his friends would never see Earth again. But the knowledge that their sacrifice had saved 2 civilizations from extinction made the losses bearable, because that was what warriors understood about the price of protecting those who could not protect themselves. The human fleet began the long journey home, carrying Zephyrian refugees, and the knowledge that the galaxy contained threats that could only be faced by those who remembered how to fight. And Admiral Morrison sent a message to Earth Command explaining that First Contact had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams, because humanity had proven that ugly ships crewed by people willing to die for strangers could accomplish miracles that beautiful vessels filled with peaceful philosophers never could. The stars looked different now to both species as they traveled through space together, because the Zephyrians had learned that freedom required eternal vigilance, while the humans had discovered that their willingness to fight made them not savage barbarians, but the guardians of civilizations that had forgotten how to guard themselves.